Do you have any personal thoughts on your own vaccination status or how that's affected you?
Yeah, so my own personal vaccination status compared to others and how it's within the careers. So being a politician, you're literally out on the public stage, and rightly or wrongly, there's tons of expectations that are placed on you to disclose a lot more private information than, quite frankly, I believe anyone really deserves to. I didn't sign up when I became a politician to drop my trousers and show you birthmarks or to tell you what I did or who I was or where I was at prior to this life. People want to dig that up and they want to see what someone's done on social media. That's one thing, but your personal healthcare records, your personal health information, your patient confidentiality with your doc back and forth, that's to me that's pretty darn sacred. So when I'm out there uh, not disclosing my vaccination status, a lot of people may think one way or the other. So the opposition hounded me nonstop. Like it's honestly, it's a flippin' witch hunt. It's brutal. And then the second part was the QR code. So as soon as I'm saying I would not have a QR code, I didn't present one. I don't believe in that system at all. Well, then all of a sudden there's more conjecture. So and I never shared with anybody my COVID story or my family's COVID story before. And I've started sharing that because now we're at a stage where I think it's okay to talk about that. And quite honestly, we've got a lot of vaccine injuries out there with folks having issues and um, tons of younger people that have potential issues that, in all probability, wouldn't have the same impact from COVID itself. So my family, we had COVID back in 2020 in January, right through up until that March timeline, uh, before it was even called COVID. So there was a ton of that taking place and going around. My own symptoms with COVID, we just happened to be on break at the time, which is the pipeliners' holidays, over that Christmas break. My daughter ended up bringing home from school. One of her friends is Turkish, and one of his aunts came over from Turkey, so there was the line that brought it over. We didn't know what it was. My youngest daughters and myself, we weren't impacted that much. My son um, and my eldest daughter and my wife got hit very hard. All of the symptoms, the high fevers, the passing out, the respiratory issues, and these kids were in Ukrainian dance. I mean, they could go nonstop. These kids literally wiped them right out, inclusive of the brain fog and then trying to deal with things. My daughter, my wife took her into the hospital, and the doc didn't know what he was dealing with. Like it was literally at that time. So he gave a spectrum of items to deal with it, and it helped. But her oxygen sats were right in the toilet, and he had no idea what he was dealing with. That's all what happened. So we had that. And my wife's background is medical as well. Her family, her dad was the doc, her mom was the nurse. She's got tons of relatives and nieces, or not nieces, but cousins that are either docs or they're nurses or pharmacists or I mean you name it. So it's pretty boned up on that side. And then also I have friends that are emergency room physicians and such, so I can reach into that area pretty quick and get some pretty off the record opinions of what's going on. So when we went through that, we saw that, so that was fine. Didn't think you'd have to get anything documented or recorded. Again, under the normal understanding, if you had something, then why would you get vaccinated for it? So, over the next course of the next year and change, I was quarantined 4 times. I had symptoms of things that were COVID like. My body fought it off really quick. Like it was literally down for a day, showing these symptoms, day, 2 days, and I fought it off. And then, mild symptoms after that. Tested negative every single time. So I also fly planes. So as my private pilot, own my own aircraft, biggest joy and one of the best accomplishments other than marrying my wife and having our kids. It's right up there. Like it's something that I worked really hard for my whole life to get. With the same token, if you ever talk to any pilot and you ground a pilot and they lose their wings, it's probably one of the most devastating things that you could ever do to a pilot is to take away their ability to fly. So with that, most pilots, we try to take care of our health. We're pretty up to speed on that. And if you're over 40, you have to do a very comprehensive medical every 2 years. So when we saw a lot of these mandates in the REP program taking place, I also had a fear and a concern of people losing their voices. And we weren't recognizing serology here. Other jurisdictions were. So I went out and I paid, and I had my own serology test taken so I could have a baseline with that. My wife did the same thing. Again, I became my own lab rat, so we would have two varying lines here. 22nd of October, I go and do my medical for my flight exams, and all good. ECG is good, blood work's good, everything's good. Getting to this age, cholesterol could be worked on, so obviously living this lifestyle is not the best. Everything's good, eyesight's good, everything's good. That afternoon I chose, and it happens to be where my office is at in Onaway. We're in the Heritage Center. It's actually a COVID vaccination site. So I whipped down the hall and rolled up my shirt sleeve and took my first shot of Pfizer. Initially, and it was in my left arm. So initially, no big deal. That was good. Went home, having supper. My wife's looking at me and she goes, "You're turning some pretty funny colors. How are you feeling?" Bit off. Next 2 days was in bed. I was sick, pretty bad. And then fastened up the chin straps and then went to the Legislative Assembly on Monday. So again, worked through it. That first week it was sore and aches. Was hoping that would kind of alleviate. The next week, the start of the week, my right shoulder started hurting. And then arthritic type symptoms like can't sleep at night, hurt in my ankles and my knees and my hips. And so now sleep is really getting torn down. So that progresses over the next few weeks. And then I went back to ICOR and had my second serology because I wanted to see the baseline on it. Now the lady had told me that she's the manager for the place and she's seen lots of different tests. And I said I had my first shot of Pfizer. She goes, "Well, don't even bother." I'm like, "Well, never see anything higher than 87 on these things. Like typically you never see anything like that." So I said, "Well, humor me." My results came back, it was 197. So again, the range is from 0 to 250. So for the first shot of Pfizer, having all these symptoms, and I'm spiking on serology. So whenever you talk to some of the folks in the medical community, they'll tell you what the conclusions are on those. But obviously I've been exposed before, had it before. The symptoms of the arthritic type thing, so autoimmune type issues, kept progressively getting worse and worse and worse. And then getting towards December 22nd is when I booked an exam with my doc again. Because I was starting to get chest pains, back was hurting, lost control of my right arm. I could not move my right shoulder without it snapping and crunching and shooting pains. I couldn't comb my hair with my right arm, lost mobility in it. So as a pilot, this is pretty disconcerting. My doc was surprised of all the issues, but being a general practitioner, couldn't talk about what the elephant in the room was. When I'd asked him about the serology tests and everything else before, because again, I did a baseline with him prior to the aviation medical as well, hadn't heard about serology exams, where you could get them. So I'm informing him as we go along as well. And then he wanted more blood work. He wanted x-rays, ultrasounds, like he's trying to figure out what's going on. He's saying, "Well, did you picking up something, rotator cuff injury?" No. And then, these other things start happening. So then started doing a litany of tests. Now, for the record out there, I'm never in the hospital. If anything, the doc is saying, "Well, why didn't you get some blood work done or anything else?" Because there's not a ton of information on me. I don't take any medications. There's none of that. I'm probably one of the most boring people when I go into a waiting room and just answer my name on the top and say there's no health issues. That was my life up till this point. So over the Christmas break, now I'm starting to work on my arm and figure out what we can do with this thing. We're going through the litany of tests and then x-rays, and found out my left lung and the lower part of my left lung was starting to collapse. There was some scarring taking place there and it was starting to close. So all of these weird things are happening. And then the first week in January, all of a sudden these massive rashes started to develop across my thighs. And hot, hurting, pain, and then all of a sudden there's little bumps coming up on my arms. So this is getting really weird. And that lasts for another week, and then my face started to change. Cheeks started to go up, my eyes started to puff out, and until finally to a point where I looked like Quasimodo going 10 rounds with Tyson and no prize money to come out of it. So the first time in my life, and my wife is looking at me going, this is getting ridiculous. And I had seen my doc in there as well before it got to that point. He's going, "If it gets really bad, go to the hospital, go to the emerge right away. How's your respiratory?" So at the time when this is happening, my respiratory is fine. I can still breathe. So it's not fitting the curve. Like if you're having an allergic reaction, typically respiratory is kind of tied with it. It wasn't. So it was isolated in that regard. Um, so he told me to take some antihistamines, gave me a prescription for that. I had some over-the-counter stuff I'd tried before that was doing nothing. I end up in the Sturgeon Hospital in the emergency entry, and it's kind of a busy night. So I'm talking to one of the security guards there, and I'm going, yeah, this is what's going on with me. How are you guys doing tonight? He goes, weird. He says, you're the third person in 20 minutes that's having some type of allergic reaction. Okay. So then it takes until, because that's how it works in the hospitals and the emerge, whoever's triaging first. If respiratory is an issue, if you're bleeding out, those are kind of priorities. So when I finally got to see the doc, it was, we went in at around 9 o'clock at night. And by the time I got to see the doc, it was about 5 in the morning. And then she shot me up full of Benadryl, was asking all those other questions and couldn't figure it out, didn't know. She says, there's nothing I can do for you, go home. So that's a bit disconcerting. My wife is just amazing. We've had 4 children. She's had way more medical things, and I've been there for her. But pretty humbling to be there, sitting there in a room, not knowing what's going on with you. The docs don't know or can't say. When I start to mention that, when I had the vaccine and things, it's almost as if they can't bring it up, but you have to, and they can't fully acknowledge it. So my doc had prescribed, my personal doc, and then prescribed prednisone for 3 days. And what that does is that steroid course, it knocks your immune system down. It's basically like a Murphy switch, so it knocks it down. And that's what ultimately helped it come down. Now my face was literally cracking and burning up. It was exuding plasma all over the place. Very painful. I had to have ice packs on my face. I would take the ice packs off and on and off every half an hour. Can't sleep at night. There's all these other things taking place. That's how bad it was, and all those arthritic pains and everything. I also had massive ache in my left jaw, and there's a nerve bundle that runs through there as well. So all of this is happening, and once the prednisone started to knock that down, the swelling in my face still took a couple of weeks for it to finally come out. And I've been 2 weeks now, 2.5 weeks now, without having to have ice packs on my face. I've never been I wouldn't think that I've been a person that's very vain, but seeing that and looking in the mirror and not recognizing that person staring back at you, that was kind of a thing. It was pretty humbling. Like if I had been in a fight, I could physical altercation, falling down a flight of stairs, anything else, yeah. But this coming out of left field, absolutely frightening and humbling. You don't know what's coming next. And then over the next bit, it was, okay, well, which specialist wants to see you? So then you're getting these recommendations and referrals, I guess I should say, to specialists. So finally, a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago now, made it into the dermatologist, and documenting this all the way along, because again, I am my own lab rat. So I'm taking pictures and I'm documenting this interesting journey, and shared those with my doc and obviously with the emergency room physician. She was documenting as well. When I make it into the dermatologist, the nurse is going through the file, and you can see her visibly reading it and seeing some of the pictures, and she's going, "Oh, you've had quite the experience." Yeah. So when he was looking at the pictures of my face, and then he looked at the legs, and the legs, he said, "Yeah, the legs are definitive. That's a vaccine injury." So even with all of this happening and my colleagues not really knowing what's going on, and when I shared that with them, and I had to advise them. So again, I guess serendipity or otherwise, if I'm this vocal and out there and outspoken, and when the opposition started pushing again of what my status was and what I was doing in that convoy, that's when I started sharing it. So yeah, I've walked a mile in the other shoes, so now everyone knows my vaccine status. But even with all those health complications taking place, I technically am not exempt from the restriction exemption program, if that were still in place. The docs had shared that the process we have for reporting vaccine injuries are difficult at best. They're, I wouldn't say obstructive, I wouldn't lead it that way, but they're struggling with it as well. The process, and we got to get through it. We have a huge vaccine uptake in the country, but we're disproportionately, compared to other jurisdictions, disproportionately low on the vaccine injury side of it, or complications. When I told other people about it, ladies for sure, tons of them came out with menstruation cycles and issues. I've had other people with calling in with heart pains, I've had other people with aches and pains. They're not even recording this because it's almost like they're being beaten up. And when I visually put this out there, people couldn't recognize me or believe me that I was putting up with this stuff for that long, until it became so painful and so apparent that it was almost like I lanced a boil on that too, and it was gushing with other people telling me their complications and issues. They were telling me before, but then there was all this empathy for it, except for some. Then they were saying I was faking it. So we've come to a point where people's health information isn't good enough. You've got the keyboard warriors that are better than 3 or 4 different doctors. They're better than the dermatologist because they're reading some BS that they believe. And now all of a sudden this divisive thing is out there. So even when you have that, there's still this stigma around having injuries. So if anybody's had issues or challenges, come free. Send it to my office. I've tabled 63 testimonies from healthcare practitioners in the House. What that does is puts it on public record of their testimonies, the things that they've dealt with AHS policies internally, the choices why they chose to do things. I've had people send in their vaccine injury testimonies as well. I open and welcome that. Send it into my office. I do believe you. I will table it in the House, and it will become part of our permanent history to be used for later, because we cannot do this again to people. We cannot have these stigmas. In the doc's own words, typically vaccines, you want this information. Every vaccine has an issue. Why don't you want to talk about it? Why don't you want to make it easy to report these issues so we have that? Pretty disconcerting. So yesterday, this is constituency week, so it's good to be back home, and it's good to be tying with constituents and those things, but I apologize to a bunch of you because I've had to deal with my own medical issues. I've never had that before, to take time off work to go to a doc. But I did find out that with my deep breathing exercises and everything else I do with my lungs, I can fly my plane again. My lung function isn't totally to where it should be, but it's good. It's a lot better than what it was, substantially different than what it was when we had those x-rays in December. So I can fly my plane. I've had it in the hangar, haven't been able to do that, and thinking that that could have been taken away from me as a side effect. I've had other young pilots come up that wanted their commercial license, and they were forced into getting vaccines to make sure that they could do that, and they can no longer fly with their vaccine injuries. They cannot fly. They cannot go into their chosen profession. There's true stories out there. There's a lot of people carrying around hurt. There's some folks carrying around guilt. But I think the only way we get past this is to literally tell these stories, make sure that it's out in the open, and be empathetic to people that made those decisions for whatever reasons. And yeah, so there's my journey so far.